Thanks for joining us today. My name's David, and in this video we're going to be talking about small outboard motors and why sometimes they don't want to start. Now, an outboard that won't start is an absolute nuisance. You can practically guarantee that whenever they misbehave, as you're tugging furiously on the starter cord, there'll be a crowd of 64 gongoozlers standing by on the bank, and some of them will be laughing at you, or even worse, offering useful suggestions. Now, after 15 minutes of that, you're going to need 6 physiotherapy sessions to fix your damaged right arm, and a long walk followed by a case of wine to fix your damaged temper. But the good news is that the most common causes of starting problems aren't that hard to fix, and you don't need to be a mechanic to solve them. If you're reasonably practical, even though you don't know much about engines, you can probably sort out your motor. Now, because we're aiming this video at people who might not know much about engines, we're going to start by getting a quick overview of the outboard and going through the basic starting checks. So if you are an experienced mechanic, that's going to be boring for you, so you might want to go off now and make a cup of tea. For the rest of us, let's go out to the garage, take a look at my outboard, understand why it might not want to start, and what we can do to fix that. So here we are in man cave number 1, and this is my Tohatsu outboard. This same outboard is made as 4, 5 and 6 horsepower versions. They're all exactly the same, except that the carburetor gets a little bit bigger on the more powerful engines. Tohatsu also make this engine for Mariner and Mercury and for Nissan. So you'll see the same motor with different brand labels on, but under the cover it's exactly the same. And so there are a lot of them out there. It's a pretty basic motor. Nothing at all fancy about it. Got the usual controls. There's a throttle lock, gear change, external fuel tank connector, stop switch, choke, and the fuel cock around the side. One other variation on this model, you can have just the external fuel tank, or as an option you can have an internal fuel tank as well. This one's got both. As I said, it's a pretty basic engine. It's quite heavy, 26 kilos. It's a lot of weight, not really practical to be carried very far. I'd say it's luggable. It's not a portable engine. But pretty robust engine, and most people have got them, seem to be quite pleased with them. So let's take the top off and have a look at what's inside. So if you're having starting problems, then there's a few obvious things that we can check to start with. Probably you've done these things anyway, but let's just walk through them just to be sure. First thing, of course, is have you got the fuel tap in the correct position? On this engine, if you've got an internal and an external tank, then the fuel tap positions, one position is for internal, one for external. There's no actual off position. My guess is that if you've got an external tank only, then you've got an on and off position here, and obviously that needs to be correct in the correct place. The next thing to check is, have you got the stop switch all the way out? Now, this stop switch is actually quite sensitive, so even if it's in just a little bit, it can prevent the engine from starting. So make sure that that is all the way out. Then, of course, have we actually got any petrol? So if you're running on the internal tank, it's no good just having a little drop in the bottom. It's not enough. You want to be making sure that's at least half full. Similarly, if you're using the external tank, make sure there's at least a litre or a bit more in there so it is feeding through into the system. Have you got the air vent open? So on the internal tank it's there, and on the external tank our air vent is here, and those have to be open for the engine to run. I doubt actually that would prevent you from starting, but it might cause the engine to conk out as you're running along. And once that's happened, you'd probably find it difficult to restart. On this engine, the gear has to be in neutral. If it's not in neutral, you won't be able to start the engine. If it's cold, we want the choke all the way out. And of course, we want to make sure that the engine is primed with fuel. So if we're using the external tank, we've got this priming bulb, and we squeeze that and pump gently through into the motor until that bulb is firm, and that makes sure that the petrol is primed all the way through to the carburetor. If you're running from the internal tank, then you don't actually have a priming mechanism, and that can be a problem, which we're going to talk about later. The other thing that's worth checking if you're running from the external tank is the connection here, the fuel pipe connection onto this thing. If that connection is loose at all, it can let air in, and if you get air in there, either your engine will run very badly or you might also have problems starting it. So it's worth checking that that is snug. If it's not snug, you're going to have to replace the connector. Now, if all those things are correct, then we'll need to dig a bit further, and that's what we're going to do next. So if your engine's not going and you've gone through all the basic checks, we need to dig a little bit further, and probably the easiest thing to check first is whether or not we're actually getting fuel at the carburetor. And one way to do that is just to slacken off the drain screw on the bottom of the carburetor, a bit of paper underneath, and see what happens. And actually that's dry. There's nothing there. Which in this case it's what I expected, because I ran this carburetor dry the last time I used this motor. The other thing you can do is just to remove this fuel pipe here, get somebody else to pull the starter cord because we need it to run the fuel pump, and then see if we're actually getting fuel out of this pipe or not. So that's what we're going to do next. And we're going to do that with the fuel coming from the internal tank, just so that we can see how long it takes before anything appears here when we've got an engine that's otherwise dry of petrol. So that was more than a dozen pulls on the cord there, and actually we got virtually no fuel out. And what that does show is that if you run the carburetor dry the last time you left the engine, and you come back and try to start using the internal tank, it's going to take a lot of pulling on that cord before you've got any fuel through into the carburetor, and the engine's going to be really hard to start. So the answer then is, once the carburetor has been run dry, the next time you come to start the motor, use the external tank and prime the fuel system using the primer on that tank. Otherwise, you're going to be hauling on this for ages. So I've now connected the external tank, and I'm just going to use the primer, and what you can see straight away is you're getting a very good flow of fuel through that pipe. And that shows that in my case, the fuel system is clear, the petrol is flowing. If you do that on your engine and you haven't got any petrol flowing out like that, then you've got a blockage. And to find that, you're going to have to trace the fuel pipes back, looking for kinks, back through the fuel pump, all the way back to the fuel tap and perhaps beyond, and find out why your petrol isn't getting through there. It is possible that you can get gunge in the filter and even perhaps gunge in the fuel pump itself, which will block the fuel flow. But it would have to be really badly blocked to stop that completely. It can happen, but it's fairly uncommon. And if you're getting fuel through this system and the engine doesn't want to go, then there's another reason that's causing the problem. And that means we've got to check a little bit further. So if we've got fuel going through into the cylinder and the engine still doesn't want to go, the next easy thing to check is the spark plug, which is just here. So we just pull off the plug cap, and we do that by gripping here, not by pulling on the wire, because you don't want to pull the wire loose. You hold the plug there. Then Tohatsu have kindly provided us with a socket to take the thing out with. Oh, it's a little bit loose, that one. So get him out. And take a look. And what we can see is this plug is actually a little bit wet. And that tells us again that fuel has been getting through there. You can also see the color. It's a bit black. That's because this engine's been running on the choke recently, and the engine was then running quite rich. It's made it black. Normally, a plug from an engine that's been running on, say, a moderate throttle opening out on the water, you'd expect that color to be a kind of a chocolatey brown color. But you know, that one's probably okay. You can't tell a great deal about whether a plug is working or not just by looking at it. So one thing you can do, which is really easy, is just swap it for another one and see if that solves your starting problem. If you haven't got a spare one, then what you can do instead is to test this one on the engine to check whether you're getting a spark. And that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to reconnect this to the HT lead. Then we're going to have somebody else pull on the starter cord whilst we hold this against an earthing point on the engine and see if we're actually getting a spark here or not. So we've got the spark plug out and we're holding it up against an earth point here. To do this test, the plug has to be earthed against the engine. And my assistant, you'll notice, is wearing heavy rubber gloves because there's 20,000 volts going through that cable, and we don't want to get a nasty electric shock. So now I'm just going to pull the cable and see whether we get a spark on it. And what you could see there is there was a pretty healthy spark, and that should certainly be enough to start the motor. If you've got that spark and your engine still won't go, then we need to dig a little bit further still. If you have no spark, then probably you've got a duff spark plug and we'll have to change the plug. The other thing that can sometimes happen, thank you, is that these connections from the HT lead into here can come slightly loose, and possibly at the other end too, in which case you want to just tighten those things up as much as you can. And probably inside of here there's a little screw thread which bites into that cable, so you have to twist it on to make sure it's firmly in there. The other thing that we don't want is any dirt or salt or anything on this lead here, because that will cause it to go to earth and then you'll lose your spark. So make sure that that lead and the plug cap here and all the rubber around it, that everything's clean and dry. So let's just say a few more words about spark plugs before we go on any further. The way the plug works, the plug cap goes on the top here and the HT lead fetches electricity to this connector, which then runs down inside the plug until it reaches this little electrode just here. And at that point, a spark has to jump across that gap to the earth electrode, and it earths out through the threaded part of the body onto the cylinder head. And that little gap is very important. It has to be just the right size. And for this particular plug, that gap should be between 0.8 and 0.9 of a millimeter, which is fairly standard actually on these type of engines. We can check that with our feeler gauge. Put that in there, and that one's good. Now, you might say, I haven't got any feeler gauges, so I can't check my spark plug. You can. Go to your wallet, get out either your credit card or your debit card from the bank. And those cards are made to an ISO standard. They have to be, because they have to fit machines all over the world. And that standard says that the cards should be 0.76 of a millimeter thick. That's about 30,000th of an inch. Now that's slightly smaller than we want for our gap here. So your credit card, the edge of it will just be a little bit loose in there if the gap is correct. If you want to check it really carefully, get a bit of aluminium foil, wrap it around the credit card and try and put that in. And that'll be just a little bit too tight if you've got the right gap. But you can still check it like that. You don't absolutely have to have these things. The other thing we want to do with this plug before we put it back in is just to lubricate it a little bit. If ever you leave a plug in an engine and it's sat there for ages, especially one that's working in a salty environment, and you get some corrosion in here, and that then seizes it into the cylinder head, you've probably got a really big and expensive problem when you try to get it out. Put a couple of drops of oil on here, and that'll lubricate it, or better still, use something like this. It's called copper grease, and that's what I use on my plugs. I just put a little bit on there, wipe it round just a wee bit. There we go. And then we've got it lubricated with copper grease. What you shouldn't use is this stuff. That's ordinary grease. Don't put that on this. And the reason is it doesn't conduct electricity. The copper grease will. And we need this to be earthed properly to the cylinder head. And if you slather grease all over it, you're going to make it harder for the spark to be earthed out. Another thing about spark plugs, you'll sometimes hear people say, oh, well, I got it straight out of the box. It's brand new and it comes pre-gapped. It's already been set at the factory. Really? How do you know? Why wouldn't you check it? It takes 60 seconds to check it. And if you don't, and it's the wrong gap, and then your engine doesn't run properly, you're going to look really stupid. It takes 60 seconds. Check the gap. The other thing that sometimes happens with these, and which can really catch people out, is you got a new plug, and people say, well, I've got a brand new plug in there. I don't need to check that. That won't be wrong. I've twice been stuck at the side of the road with a broken down motorcycle with exactly the same brand of plugs in it, and they'd only been in the engine for 3 or 4 hours and they'd failed. So new plugs can and they do go wrong. Don't assume it's working. It's really quick to check. Put a second one in or look for the spark like we did before, and then you'll be sure. Don't assume that because it's new, it's working. It might not be. Okay, so that's enough on this. Just one thing finally before we finish on this. When we put this back in the cylinder head, we want to be fairly gentle with it. There's no need to be brutal when you're putting it into the engine. I'll show you what I mean. This can go in there just by hand, and it should screw in really easily. If it doesn't go in really easily, you've either got it cross-threaded or there's something wrong here. Once you've got it in by hand like that, we take our box spanner, kindly provided by Mr. Tohatsu, and we just nip it up. That's all. We're not trying to ram that thing in there as hard as we can. If you really go a little bit over the top when you're tightening this thing up, it's really easy to strip the thread in those cylinder heads. And if you do that, you've created a really expensive and difficult problem to fix. So just be easy. You don't want to be applying any more pressure than, say, you might use to put the lid back on a jar of jam. That's all it needs.